The air inside the penthouse suite of New York's Atlas Tower was so thin and still, it felt borrowed from a vacuum-sealed tomb. Below, the city glittered, a galaxy of ambition and indifference. But up here, on the 96th floor, an empire was on the verge of collapsing under the crushing weight of silence. On one side of a sprawling obsidian table sat Marcus Vance, the founder and CEO of Vance Global Construction, a man who had built his legacy by bending steel and concrete to his will. His face, usually a mask of rugged determination, was now a roadmap of pure, unadulterated fury. Opposite him sat Sheikh Khalid al-Jamil of the United Arabian Emirates, a man whose wealth was as vast and ancient as the desert sands his ancestors had roamed. A deal hung between them, a contract of such staggering scale it would make history. The construction of Al-Fajr, the Dawn City, a trillion-dollar futuristic metropolis designed to rise from the Emirati desert. It was the crowning achievement of Marcus Vance's life. But after 4 agonizing hours, the deal was not just dying, it was already cold. The official interpreter, a man with a 6-figure salary and a doctorate in linguistics, had been summarily dismissed 2 hours earlier, his textbook Arabic utterly useless against the nuanced, poetry-inflected dialect of the Sheikh's delegation. Now desperation was the only language being spoken, and no one understood a word. The Atlas Tower was built to project power. Its floor-to-ceiling windows showcased dominance over the skyline. Its minimalist furniture screamed of untouchable wealth, and its staff were trained to be as unobtrusive as shadows. Tonight, however, the silence in the penthouse was not one of peace, but of abject failure. It was a thick, suffocating fog of misunderstanding, a chasm between two worlds that no amount of money could seem to bridge. Layla Qasim felt that chasm the moment she stepped out of the service elevator, a tray of untouched, lukewarm mint tea balanced perfectly in her hand. She wasn't a penthouse server. Her domain was the hotel's bustling ground floor brasserie. But tonight, a stomach bug had swept through the senior staff, and the Vance meeting was a code-red event. Layla, with her preternatural calm and ability to become part of the furniture, had been drafted upstairs. From across the vast room, she saw him. Marcus Vance. His image was a fixture on the covers of Fortune and Architectural Digest. In photos, he was a titan, a visionary with eyes that saw blueprints in the clouds. In person, hunched in his $1,000 suit, he looked like a king trapped in a collapsing castle. His jaw was a block of granite, his knuckles bone white where he gripped a pen, not to sign a contract, but to keep from the smashing it through the polished black table. Beside him was his son, Julian Vance, the company's vice president of global relations. Julian, handsome in a slick, rehearsed way, kept glancing at his phone, a sheen of sweat on his brow. He was the picture of entitled panic. On the other side of the table sat Sheikh Khalid. He was a man in his late 60s, with a meticulously trimmed white beard and eyes that held the patient, knowing depth of the desert itself. His silence was the most powerful force in the room. It was not an absence of sound, but a presence of judgment. Flanking him were his advisors, their faces unreadable, their traditional white gutras, a stark contrast to the Vance's dark business suits. Layla knew the whispers from the staff lounge. This was the final meeting, the make-or-break moment. Vance Global had beaten out dozens of international competitors for the Al-Fajr project. It was a done deal, or so everyone thought. But for a week, negotiations had stalled, snagged on what the hotel manager called cultural friction. The friction had now become a full-blown rupture. Layla's job was simple: clear the old tea, serve the new, and vanish. As she moved with quiet grace around the perimeter of the room, she couldn't help but overhear the pathetic, flailing attempts at communication. "The efficiency," Marcus Vance said, his voice slow and loud, as if the sheikh were deaf rather than simply not a native English speaker. He made a sharp, chopping gesture with his hand. "Fast. We build fast. Good." Sheikh Khalid watched the crude pantomime with a look of profound weariness before murmuring something in low, melodic Arabic to his advisor. The advisor nodded, his lips tightening as he replied in a whisper. Layla, her hand hovering over a delicate porcelain cup, went utterly still. She understood every syllable. He speaks of speed as if he is selling a racehorse, not building a home for 1 million soul, the sheikh had said. It is the American way, Your Excellency, the advisor had replied. They mistake haste for progress. They have no patience for the roots of the tree. They only wish to sell the fruit. Layla's heart began to beat a frantic rhythm against her ribs. A wave of heat crept up her neck. It had been years since she had been surrounded by the language of her childhood, the language that was as much a part of her as her own blood. Her entire life, her planned future, had been woven from the intricate beauty of the Arabic language and its rich history, a future that had been stolen from her, leaving her here, serving tea to men who were carelessly trampling the very garden she had once tended. She continued her silent task, her movements on autopilot while her mind raced. She thought of her father's study in their old home, overflowing with books on Islamic architecture and classical Arabic poetry. He had been a professor at Columbia, a leading scholar in Middle Eastern studies, a man who saw bridges between cultures where others saw walls. He had taught her that Arabic was not just a language, it was a worldview, a vessel of history, honor, and a deep sense of place. Then in the space of 6 months, a rare, aggressive form of cancer had taken him, leaving behind a mountain of medical debt that had devoured their savings and their home. The scholarships, the academic accolades, the path to her own professorship, it had all evaporated, replaced by the crushing, immediate need to keep a roof over her head and provide for her younger sister Yasmin, who was now a freshman at a local city college. So Layla had done what she had to do. She had put her life on hold and taken a job at the hotel, a job that offered steady hours and the anonymity she craved. Julian Vance suddenly leaned forward, his smartphone held out like a shield. Father, I have the latest translation software. It's state-of-the-art, AI-driven. Let me try again. Marcus looked at his son with the gaze of a man so lost he'd follow a ghost. Do something, Julian. Anything. Julian cleared his throat, tapped his screen, and a tinny robotic voice filled the silence, speaking a garbled, grammatically horrifying version of Arabic. He was trying to articulate a point about supply chain logistics, but what the app produced was an almost incoherent string of words that sounded like a menu being read backward. Layla physically winced. It wasn't just inaccurate, it was insulting. The app was using a coarse, street-level Egyptian dialect while addressing a formal royal court from the Gulf. Worse, it was using masculine verb forms when referencing the future city, a subtle but grating error. It was the linguistic equivalent of wearing muddy work boots to a royal wedding. Sheikh Khalid's eyes narrowed almost imperceptibly. He did not speak, but he reached for the silver lid of his teacup and placed it carefully back on top. It was a small gesture, but it was as final as a gavel strike. It was the signal that hospitality had ended. The evening and the trillion-dollar deal was over. Marcus Vance saw it. A tremor of panic finally broke through his frustration. No, he breathed, the word a plea. The Sheikh's senior advisor spoke, his English crisp and precise, learned at Cambridge. Mr. Vance, we thank you for your time. It seems there is an insurmountable gap between our visions. We will be in touch with our formal withdrawal. He began to gather his papers. The finality of it finally shattered Marcus Vance's composure. He slammed his open palm down on the obsidian table. It wasn't a loud bang, but a flat, sharp crack that made the teacups jump. A gap? He hissed, his voice trembling with a rage born of utter impotence. $1 trillion, 5 years of my life, my legacy, gone. All because nobody in this damn room can speak a simple sentence of Arabic? The silence that answered him was absolute and devastating. The weight of it pressed down, suffocating the last vestiges of hope. Layla stood near the service door, tray in hand, an invisible witness to a colossal failure. She saw the raw desperation on the American faces and the cold, unbreachable dignity on the faces of the Arabs. But more than that, she heard what they couldn't, the silent scream of two cultures talking past each other. And in that moment, a wild, terrifying idea ignited in her mind, an idea that could get her fired, humiliated, and cast out onto the street. Or just maybe it could change everything. The air in the penthouse suite crackled with the ozone of Marcus Vance's fury. His outburst had stripped away the last pretense of corporate diplomacy, leaving the raw, bleeding wound of their failure exposed to the world. He was breathing hard, his face a mottled red, his eyes darting between the impassive sheikh and his own defeated son. He looked like a king who had just watched his crown melt before his eyes. Sheikh Khalid rose slowly from his chair, his movements deliberate and graceful. The faint rustle of his pristine white robes was the only sound in the room, a sound of imminent departure. His advisors stood with him, their faces set like stone. The end was not coming. It had arrived. "Please," Marcus Vance said, his voice now ragged and hollow. He stood up, leaning across the vast table as if to physically hold them there. "Sheikh Khalid, please, this is a misunderstanding. The project, the vision, it's sound." The sheikh looked at him, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than disappointment crossed his face. It was a distant, regal pity. He responded in Arabic, his voice calm and measured, addressing his own men, but intending the weight of his words to be felt by all. Layla, frozen by the door, felt the meaning of his words land like stones in her stomach. "The vision is irrelevant if the eyes of the visionary are blind," Sheikh Khalid stated. "He does not see the soul of the city we wish to build. He sees only a monument to himself. How can we entrust our future to a man who does not have the respect to understand our past?" Julian Vance, desperate to redeem himself, held up his phone again. "Father, the app says he's concerned about the monument soul. It's a metaphor for the respect of the past." It was a clumsy, literal, and soul-crushingly inept translation. It stripped the Sheikh's profound statement of all its poetry and power, reducing it to a bizarre, nonsensical phrase. "Monument soul? What in God's name does that mean?" Marcus roared, turning his frustration on his son. "Are we in a philosophy class, Julian? Or are we trying to close the biggest construction deal in human history?" "I think he means the foundation of the idea," Julian stammered, his face pale with sweat. "The basis for the soul." It was a train wreck in slow motion. Julian's fumbling was like trying to explain the color blue to a blind man by describing the chemical composition of the sky. He was taking the sheikh's eloquent expression of cultural and spiritual values and mangling it into meaningless corporate buzzwords. Layla watched it all, her mind a storm of indignation. This wasn't just about language, it was about worldview. For Marcus Vance, this was a project of logistics, engineering, and finance. For Sheikh Khalid, a man whose lineage could be traced back through desert poets and warriors, it was about creating a legacy, a beacon for his people, a place that would honor tradition while embracing the future. It was a sacred trust, a trust that could never be conveyed by a glitchy app or a terrified executive who thought the Arab world was a monolith. She felt an academic's fury at seeing her life's passion so brutally dismembered. These were not just words. They were the building blocks of a civilization. Julian Vance was smashing priceless artifacts and showing his father the dust, pretending it was the same thing. Her own life had been shaped by the power of words, the carefully chosen words of solace she whispered to her sister, Yasmin, after their father's death. The cold, unforgiving words on the bank letters that had taken their home, the patronizing words of the university dean explaining that her scholarship couldn't be deferred. "The program is highly competitive, Ms. Kasim. We can't simply hold a place for you indefinitely while you sort out your personal affairs." Words had dismantled her world. Perhaps, just perhaps, they could rebuild it. The sheikh gave a single formal nod to Marcus Vance, a gesture of dismissal that was universally understood. He began to turn away. The trillion-dollar dream was dissolving into the silent, air-conditioned air. Marcus Vance looked utterly broken. He had clawed his way up from nothing, a boy from Queens who built a global empire with his bare hands and an iron will. Now, at the pinnacle of his career, he was defeated by a barrier he couldn't see, let alone break. He opened his mouth, but no sound came out. What could he say? Shout louder? Use bigger hand gestures? He was at the edge of the abyss. Layla's feet felt nailed to the floor. Every instinct, every rule of her job, screamed at her to stay invisible. A server's role was to be a ghost, a silent functionary. Getting involved was professional suicide. They wouldn't see her as a savior. They would see her as an upstart, a servant who had forgotten her place. She would be fired before she could even offer an explanation. And Yasmin was counting on her next paycheck for her textbooks. But then, as Sheikh Khalid turned to leave, his senior advisor muttered one final, cutting remark to his colleague, a low whisper not meant for Western ears. "It is as we feared. Their ambition is wide, but their roots are shallow. They want to build our city on sand, without understanding the wisdom of the Oasis." That was it. That was the spark that lit the fuse. The phrase wisdom of the Oasis, Hikmat al-Waha, was a direct echo from one of her father's favorite poems by al-Mutanabi. It wasn't about the deal anymore. It was about honor. Not Marcus Vance's honor, but the honor of her father's memory, the honor of true understanding, of bridging the gap that everyone else in this room saw as an uncrossable void. It was the pride of the scholar she had been forced to bury alive. Before her rational mind could chain her down, before the fear could turn her legs to water, Layla took one step forward out of the shadows. Her voice, when it emerged, was not loud, but it possessed a clarity that sliced through the funereal hush of the suite like a sliver of glass. She did not speak to Marcus Vance. She did not look at her managers who were hovering anxiously by the door. She looked directly at Sheikh Khalid al-Jamil, who had his back half turned to her. And in flawless, classical Arabic, imbued with the formal courtly accent she had learned at her father's knee, she recited the first line of the poem. "Do not dismiss the stillness of the desert," she said, her voice clear and resonant. "For in its silence lies the memory of every storm." The world stopped. For 5 full seconds, the only sound was the faint ambient hum of the building's climate control. Layla's words, perfectly enunciated and rich with historical context, hung in the air like a ringing bell. Sheikh Khalid froze in mid-stride. His entire body went rigid. Slowly, deliberately, as if turning a great stone wheel, he turned his head, then his entire body to face the source of this impossible sound. His eyes, which had been hooded with disappointment, were now wide with utter, unadulterated shock. He stared at Layla, this young woman in a simple black server's uniform, as if she had just recited the secret name of God. His 2 advisors looked equally poleaxed, their mouths hanging slightly open. The American side of the table was a tableau of utter confusion. They didn't understand the words, but they understood the seismic shift in the room's atmosphere. They saw the Arab's astonishment, and it communicated more than any app ever could. Marcus Vance's face cycled through a series of emotions. Bewilderment, then sharp irritation, and finally a surge of pure volcanic fury. Who was this woman? A waitress? How dare she? How dare she interrupt this corporate wake? For one insane moment, he thought she might be offering them more sugar for their tea. "What the hell is going on?" he demanded, his voice a raw rasp. "Who said that? You!" He jabbed a trembling finger toward Layla. "What did you just say?" Layla's heart was a wild hawk beating against her ribs. The adrenaline roaring in her ears was a physical force. The sheer, terrifying audacity of what she had done washed over her, and she felt her knees threaten to buckle. She had spoken. She had crossed an uncrossable line. She, the ghost, had given voice in a room full of kings. But she kept her eyes fixed on Sheikh Khalid. She held his gaze, her expression one of profound respect, but not subservience. The scholar within her had taken command, the part of her that knew this was a debate, a defense of a thesis, not an act of insubordination. The sheikh took a step toward her, his eyes scanning her face, searching for an explanation for this phenomenon. He replied in Arabic, his voice no longer flat and weary, but filled with a deep, cautious curiosity. You speak the old tongue, the tongue of the poets." It was not a question, it was a statement of awe. "Yes, Your Excellency," Layla replied, her voice steady as she maintained the formal address. "It was my father's gift to me. He believed that to build for the future, One must first understand the language of the past. The choice of words was meticulous. My father's gift, the language of the past. It conveyed a depth of heritage and reverence that transcended a mere language skill. It was a sign to the sheikh that she was not an interpreter. She was a kindred spirit. On the American side, the confusion was curdling into outrage. "Julian, what are they saying?" Marcus snapped, turning on his son. Julian looked utterly broken. I don't know, sir. She's speaking. It's not like the app. It's formal, old." His inability to even identify the register of the language was the final nail in the coffin of his credibility. Julian Vance's career at his father's company was over, and he knew it. He was a monument to the very ignorance Layla had just effortlessly transcended. "Shut up, Julian," Marcus seethed, his eyes locked on Layla. "You, waitress, what's your name?" "Layla Kasim, sir," she said, her hands clasped tightly behind her back to hide their trembling. "Ms. Kasim," Marcus said, his voice dripping with venom, "you are fired. Collect your things and get out of this building. You have no conception of the damage you have just done." He turned back to the sheikh, planning to offer a final, groveling apology for the bizarre interruption from his hotel staff. But Sheikh Khalid was not looking at him. He was still looking at Layla. He held up a hand, a regal, undeniable gesture for Marcus Vance to be silent. He addressed Layla again in Arabic. "The advisor to my right said your people see us only as money, not as people with history. Your outburst? Was that a defense of them, or a reprimand to us?" This was the precipice. She could apologize, retreat, and accept her fate, or she could leap. She took a deep breath. "Your Excellency," she began, her Arabic flowing with an academic precision she hadn't summoned in years. "It was neither. It was a defense of the space between you. Your advisor spoke of shallow roots. Mr. Vance spoke of speed. You are both speaking of the same tree, but one is describing the unseen roots that anchor it to the earth, and the other is describing the height of its branches against the sky. A tree cannot survive without both." She paused, letting the metaphor settle. The sheikh's expression was now one of intense, focused concentration. He was no longer looking at a waitress. He was listening to a sage. "The issue here is not a lack of respect," Layla continued, her confidence swelling with every sentence. "It is a difference in the poetry of ambition. Mr. Vance and his company see progress through the poetry of the skyscraper, a testament to human will, reaching for the heavens, built with precision and speed. You, Your Excellency, see progress through the poetry of the Oasis, a testament to wisdom, nurturing life in a harsh land, built with patience and a deep understanding of the environment. He is speaking the language of steel and glass. You are speaking the language of water and sand. You need a translator who understands both poems." When she finished, the room was so profoundly silent she could hear the frantic thump of her own heart. She had laid the entire conflict bare. She had diagnosed the core cultural misunderstanding that a team of multi-million-dollar consultants had completely missed. She had done it in a language one side didn't understand, defending the very man who had just fired her to the man he had irrevocably offended. Marcus Vance stood there, a titan rendered utterly powerless. His face was a canvas of rage, confusion, and a dawning, terrifying suspicion that he was the biggest fool in the room. He knew something extraordinary was happening, but he was locked outside the palace gates, hearing only echoes. Sheikh Khalid stared at Layla for a long, unblinking moment. Then he turned to Marcus Vance, and for the first time that night, he spoke to him in slow, heavily accented but perfectly clear English. "Mr. Vance," he said, his voice a low, commanding rumble, "we will not be leaving. And this young woman, Ms. Kasim, she is not fired." He gestured to the empty high-back chair that the failed interpreter had abandoned. "She will sit." The command was absolute. She will sit. For a moment, no one moved. Marcus Vance looked as if the sheikh had struck him. He, the master of this universe, had just been publicly countermanded in his own penthouse suite over his own employee. The entire power structure of the room had not just been tilted, it had been shattered and reassembled with a waitress at its center. One of the hotel managers, a man named Henderson, who had been watching in horror from the doorway, made a move to intervene. A single sharp glance from the sheikh froze him in place. Still numb with shock, Layla walked from the safety of the wall to the gleaming obsidian table. The journey of 20 feet felt like crossing a desert. She was acutely aware of her simple, comfortable work shoes on the priceless Persian rug. She pulled out the heavy leather chair and sat down. The practical black fabric of her uniform felt coarse and alien in this world of bespoke suits and silk robes. She placed her hands on the table, her server's instincts warring with the terrifying new reality of her role. "Now," the sheikh said, reverting to Arabic and speaking directly to Layla. Mr. Vance was speaking of efficiency, a clumsy word. "Tell me, what is his vision for the heart of Al-Fajr? Not in his words of haste, but in a way a man who builds gardens in the desert might understand." Every eye in the room swiveled to Layla. Marcus Vance's gaze was a toxic cocktail of suspicion, humiliation, and a sliver of desperate hope. He was trapped. His trillion-dollar legacy was now, inexplicably, in the hands of a waitress whose name he hadn't known 5 minutes ago. Layla turned to him. Her voice was quiet, but it carried a new authority. "Mr. Vance, the sheikh asks you to explain your vision for the city. Not the timeline, not the budget. He asks you to describe its heart, its soul. He wants to know what kind of garden you intend to build." Vance blinked, thrown by the question. He was used to talking about load-bearing walls and profit margins. "Garden? It's a city, the most advanced city in the world." "Yes, sir," Layla said patiently, "but he sees a city as a living thing. Does it have a place for families to gather? For children to learn? For art? Or is it just a collection of tall buildings?" This reframing of the question was a revelation. It sliced through the corporate jargon and struck at the core of the cultural divide. Vance was silent for a moment, the powerful gears of his mind shifting. He looked at Sheikh Khalid, truly looked at him for the first time, not as a client or an obstacle, but as a fellow builder, a fellow dreamer. "All right," he said, his tone changing. The raw anger was gone, replaced by the focused intensity that had built his empire. "Okay, tell him this." He began to speak and Layla began to translate, but she was doing far more than translating. She was transmuting. When Vance said, "Our integrated smart grid will optimize resource allocation for maximum sustainability and economic output," Layla didn't just mimic the words in Arabic. She listened, processed the core idea, and then conveyed its soul. "Your Excellency," she would say, her Arabic flowing like poetry, "Mr. Vance envisions the city's power not as a mere utility, but as the city's circulatory system. Like the ancient Falaj irrigation channels that brought life to the desert, this new system will carry the lifeblood of energy and information to every home, school, and hospital, ensuring that not a single drop of the community's precious resources is wasted." As she spoke, a visible transformation came over Sheikh Khalid. His stern posture softened. He leaned forward, his eyes alight with genuine interest. He began to nod, not out of politeness, but in true comprehension. He started to ask questions, complex and nuanced questions about community spaces, architectural aesthetics that honored Islamic tradition, and the integration of green spaces. Vance, in turn, answered with a passion for his craft that had been buried under decades of boardroom battles. He spoke of his dream to build something that would last 1,000 years, a city that would be a model for the world. And with every exchange, Layla was the indispensable bridge. She didn't just swap vocabulary, she found the correct cultural and philosophical equivalents. She transformed Vance's talk of disruptive technology into the Arabic concept of tajdid, or renewal within tradition. She converted his aggressive, market-leading strategies into a more resonant discussion of building a legacy of karama, or dignity, for the city's future residents. She was home. The years spent in her father's library, poring over ancient texts, debating the philosophical underpinnings of urban design from Cordoba to Isfahan, it was all flooding back. This wasn't a business negotiation. It was a live performance of her abandoned doctoral thesis. She was weaving together two worlds, revealing the common ground that had been hidden in plain sight. Julian Vance sat in his chair, shrinking with every elegant phrase Layla uttered. He had tried to be the hero with his smartphone app. Now he was less than a spectator. He was an artifact of the very ignorance that Layla was so brilliantly dismantling. A venomous, bitter jealousy coiled in his gut. After an hour of intense, electrifying conversation, the hotel manager Henderson cautiously approached the table, intending to ask about dinner service. He looked at Layla, sitting at the table, commanding the attention of a CEO and a sheikh, and his face was a mask of utter stupefaction. Layla gave him a subtle shake of her head, and he backed away as if he'd seen an apparition. Finally, Sheikh Khalid held up a hand. He looked from Vance to Layla, and a small, warm smile touched his lips for the first time. He spoke in Arabic. Ms. Qasim, in the addendum to the master agreement, there is a section our lawyers have named the Oasis Charter. Mr. Vance's son dismissed it as local folklore and recommended it be struck. It has been the main point of contention for a week. I want you to explain it to Mr. Vance. Explain why it is not folklore, but the very foundation upon which the entire city must stand. Layla's blood ran cold. The Oasis Charter. She knew nothing about it. She was a scholar, not a contract lawyer. The fragile confidence she had painstakingly built over the past hour threatened to disintegrate. Sir, she said to Vance, her voice faltering for the first time, the sheikh is referring to a section in the contract, the Oasis Charter. He says your team, specifically your son, wanted it removed and that it has been the primary obstacle. Vance's face darkened. He shot a venomous look at Julian, who seemed to shrink another inch. The Oasis Charter, Vance grumbled. It's a dozen pages of sentimental nonsense about funding poetry festivals and building traditional gardens. It's unenforceable. It has no place in a construction contract. Our lawyers were right to flag it. Layla looked from the sheikh, whose gaze was now testing her, to Vance, whose impatience was returning. She was trapped in the crossfire of the single most critical point of the entire negotiation, and she was flying blind. The warmth in the room began to cool, the old tensions threatening to return. Tell the sheikh, Vance said, his voice clipped, that we build buildings, not poems. We can make a corporate donation to a cultural fund, but we will not embed vague, sentimental clauses into a trillion-dollar legal document. Layla took a steadying breath, her mind racing. A direct, literal translation of Vance's dismissive tone would destroy the delicate bridge she had just built. She turned to the sheikh. Your Excellency, she began in careful diplomatic Arabic. Mr. Vance recognizes the deep importance of your cultural heritage. His legal advisors, however, unfamiliar with the spirit of the Charter, are concerned that its poetic language could create legal ambiguities. They are accustomed to the language of iron and concrete and are struggling to interpret the language of the soul. She had softened the blow, but the message remained. The Charter was a problem. The sheikh listened, his expression unreadable. When she was finished, he reached into his leather briefcase, retrieved a sheaf of papers bound in a simple blue folder, and slid it across the obsidian table to Layla. The document was in Arabic. Read it, Ms. Qasim, he commanded, not as a client, but as a professor testing his prize student. Read it with your father's eyes, then you will understand. Layla's hands trembled slightly as she opened the folder. The text was not dense legalese. It was, as Vance had said, almost poetic. But it was also fiercely specific. It spoke of the project's duty not only to its investors, but to the land itself. It mandated that a significant percentage of the city's water be sourced from sustainable desalination and that all gray water be used to cultivate a massive greenbelt of native desert plants, creating a new ecosystem. It required the establishment of a world-class university dedicated to both technological innovation and the preservation of Arabic and Islamic history, with free tuition for all Emirati citizens. It stipulated the creation of architectural committees to ensure that modern designs incorporated traditional motifs and building techniques, ensuring Al-Fajr would feel like an Arab city, not a generic glass and steel metropolis airlifted into the desert. It wasn't folklore. It was a covenant between a ruler and his land. It was the wisdom of the Oasis, made manifest in a contract. It was everything her father had ever taught her about the holistic, spiritually infused nature of classical Islamic civilization. They didn't just build cities, they cultivated societies. Vance's team saw a liability. Sheikh Khalid saw a promise to his grandchildren. Then, Layla saw it. Tucked into the folder was a single sheet of paper, an English summary memo with the Vance Global letterhead. It was clearly Julian's work. He had summarized the charter in a few dismissive bullet points. Mandatory funding for nonprofit cultural initiatives, burdensome environmental regulations, unnecessary aesthetic oversight. At the bottom, he had typed a final recommendation initialed JV. Recommend striking this entire section. It's a classic play for ancillary funding and creates long-term PR liabilities. Client is overly sentimental about his heritage. We can placate him with a one-time donation to a museum. Her eyes flickered up to Julian. He was watching her, a look of pure terror on his face. He knew she held his execution order in her hands. He hadn't just misunderstood the charter. He had deliberately and arrogantly misrepresented its profound cultural and ecological significance, reframing it as a cynical cash grab to his father and the legal team. He had taken the soul of the project and labeled it a cancer. This was the rot. This was the true source of the misunderstanding. The entire negotiation had been poisoned from the inside. I understand, Layla said softly, looking up from the papers, her eyes locking with the Sheikh's. Her voice was now imbued with a quiet, unshakable authority. She turned to Marcus Vance. Sir, with all due respect to you and your lawyers, you have been profoundly misled about what this charter contains. She held up Julian's memo. The person who advised you on this document dismissed it as sentimental. That is not a mistranslation. It is a fundamental and catastrophic failure of intelligence. What are you talking about? Vance demanded, his gaze fixed on the memo in her hand. This isn't a list of sentimental requests, sir, Layla explained, her voice ringing with the passion of her convictions. This is the city's moral compass. The Sheikh is not asking for handouts. He is mandating a partnership with the land and with history. He is ensuring that Al-Fajr has roots. The environmental provisions aren't burdensome. They are a sacred duty in a desert nation where water is more precious than oil. The university isn't an ancillary initiative. It's the engine that will power the city's future for centuries. He is asking you to build a city with a soul, and the person you entrusted with this task advised you to perform a lobotomy. She slid the folder across the table to Vance. He's not asking you to build him a monument, Mr. Vance. He is asking you to help him build a future. He is testing you. He needs to know if you are a man who understands the wisdom of the Oasis, or just another man who wants to sell fruit from a dying tree. The room was utterly still. Layla had just performed open-heart surgery on the deal, exposing the diseased tissue that had been killing it for weeks. She had recontextualized the entire conflict, transforming it from a legal dispute into a profound test of character, vision, and honor. Marcus Vance stared at the memo, his son's callous, dismissive words burning into his brain. He looked at Layla, then at Sheikh Khalid, and finally at his son, his pale, terrified son. The pieces of the puzzle, the weeks of friction, the reports from Julian about the difficult and unreasonable Arabs, the baffling impasse, all slammed into place with the force of a physical blow. He had been fighting a war on the wrong front, using a map drawn by a traitor. Finally, Marcus Vance looked at Sheikh Khalid. The anger was gone, replaced by a deep, dawning shame and a hard-won respect. He had been weighed, and he had been found wanting. Ask him, Vance said to Layla, his voice low and heavy with contrition, if he would do me the great honor of allowing me to reread this charter with him, page by page, and explain how I will personally ensure that every word is honored. Layla turned back to Sheikh Khalid, her role shifting once again. She was no longer just an interpreter. She was a master of ceremonies for a resurrection. Your Excellency, she relayed, her Arabic formal yet filled with the gravity of the moment. Mr. Vance wishes to offer his most profound apology. He admits he has been seeing this charter through a blindfold, woven by another's ignorance. He asks for the honor of your guidance, to learn the wisdom within these pages, and to give you his personal vow, as a builder and as a man, to become the custodian of its vision. The choice of words, honor, guidance, vow, custodian, was everything. They were the keys to this kingdom. For the first time all evening, Sheikh Khalid leaned back in his chair and smiled. It was a genuine, radiant smile that transformed his stern face, making him look like a benevolent grandfather. It was a smile that said he was finally ready to listen. And so began the true negotiation for the city of Al-Fajr. Guided by Layla's seamless interpretation, prompted by her deep cultural insights, Marcus Vance and Sheikh Khalid did not talk as adversaries across a legal divide, but as partners laying the first foundation stone of a shared dream. Vance didn't talk about profit margins. He talked about his own grandfather, a stonemason from Sicily who taught him that a building must have good bones and a true heart. He spoke of his awe at the Sheikh's vision for a sustainable, human-centric city. He confessed that in his relentless pursuit of global expansion, he had sometimes forgotten the lessons of that old stonemason. Layla translated it all, capturing the newfound humility in Vance's voice, the sincere regret, and the deep, abiding respect. She conveyed it not as a business tactic, but as a confession of faith from one builder's grandson to another. "Tell him," Vance said, leaning forward, his hands open on the table, "that I see it now. The Oasis Charter is not a liability. It is the architectural plan for the city's soul, and I will not sign this contract without it. I will stake my company's name and my personal honor on upholding it." When Layla translated this, a quiet murmur of approval went through the Sheikh's delegation. Sheikh Khalid looked at Marcus Vance, studying his face, searching for any hint of artifice. He found none. The American CEO, who hours before had been a caricature of arrogant impatience, now looked like a man who had rediscovered his own purpose. The Sheikh asked sharp, insightful questions. How would Vance Global partner with local Emirati firms? How would they establish apprenticeship programs to train a new generation of local engineers and artisans? How would they ensure the city's design respected the quiet privacy essential to Arab family life? These were questions Julian Vance had dismissed as trivial, but with Layla to explain the deep cultural context behind them, Marcus rose to the occasion. He didn't offer corporate platitudes, he offered creative, collaborative solutions. He proposed establishing a joint legacy council, co-chaired by the Sheikh himself, to oversee the implementation of the charter. He pledged to fund a permanent chair for Islamic architecture at the new university. He wasn't just agreeing to the terms, he was embracing them, amplifying them. The atmosphere in the room was reborn. The icy tension had melted, replaced by the warmth of shared purpose and mutual admiration. Finally, after another 2 hours of impassioned, productive dialogue, Sheikh Khalid stood up. Marcus Vance and his team immediately rose as well. The Sheikh walked around the table until he stood directly in front of Layla. He looked down at her, his dark eyes filled not with regal authority, but with a profound and sincere gratitude. "Ms. Qasim," he said in Arabic, his voice resonating with emotion. "In my 70 years, I have dealt with presidents, prime ministers, and the finest diplomats in the world. I can say with all sincerity that you are the most gifted communicator I have ever had the honor to meet. Tonight, you did not simply translate our words, you translated our spirits." He then switched to his crisp English for all to hear. "You have saved more than a contract. You have forged a friendship." He turned to Marcus and extended his hand. "Mr. Vance, we have a deal. Send the contract to my hotel in the morning. Do not change a word of the charter." Vance seized his hand, a broad, incredulous smile spreading across his face. "You have my word, Your Excellency, my honor on it." The handshake was a covenant, the relief in the room a palpable force. As the two leaders shared a quiet laugh, Marcus Vance turned his attention to his son. His voice, now devoid of all heat, was as cold and sharp as a shard of ice. "Julian," he said, not even deigning to look at him, "your security access has been revoked. A car is waiting for you downstairs to take you to your apartment. Have your desk cleared out by noon tomorrow." Julian stared at his father, his face a grotesque mask of panic and disbelief. He opened his mouth to plead, to protest, But a single withering glare from Marcus silenced him completely. He grabbed his briefcase and almost ran from the room, a ghost exorcised from the feast. The path of destruction carved by his arrogance was gone. In its place stood Layla Qasim, the quiet waitress who had single-handedly resurrected a trillion-dollar dream. Marcus Vance now turned to her, his expression a complex tapestry of gratitude, shame, and sheer unadulterated awe. "Ms. Qasim," he began, his voice rough with emotion, "I owe you an apology, and I owe you a debt that I'm not sure I can ever truly repay." The aftermath felt like waking from a fever dream. The Sheikh's delegation, now warm and animated, were sharing stories with Marcus Vance over a fresh pot of cardamom-scented coffee. The penthouse, which hours ago had been a tomb of failure, now felt like a cradle of creation. In the midst of it all, Layla sat, an island of quiet shock. She had come here to serve tea. She was leaving as the architect of a bridge between worlds. Marcus Vance, after seeing the Sheikh and his party to their private elevator, came back and sat down opposite her. He didn't sit like a CEO. He sat like a man humbled by a miracle. "I was a fool," he said, his voice stripped of its usual command. "I was arrogant. I was blind, and I was about to throw away the single most valuable person in this company before she was even in it. There's no excuse. I am sorry." "It's all right, Mr. Vance," Layla murmured, her head still spinning. "It was a high-pressure situation." "Pressure reveals character," he countered, shaking his head. "And tonight it revealed mine. And yours." He paused, studying her with a new, intense curiosity. "My executive assistant did a quick search on you while I was speaking with the Sheikh. Columbia University, Department of Middle Eastern, South Asian and African Studies. Doctoral candidate. Specialization in classical Arabic poetry and its influence on urban planning. Summa cum laude. Dean's List every year. Full academic scholarship." He looked at her, his eyes filled with wonder. "What happened?" The question was blunt, but the tone was one of genuine sympathy. And for the first time in years, Layla felt no shame in telling her story. She spoke of her father, his brilliance, his illness. She spoke of the debts, of her little sister Yasmin's future, and of the dissertation on her laptop, a brilliant, unfinished symphony gathering digital dust. Vance listened, his gaze never leaving her face. When she finished, a long silence settled between them. "You sacrificed your dream for your family," he said finally. "It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. That is honor, that is legacy, the very things I was too damn stupid to see in the Sheikh's charter. You weren't just studying it, Ms. Qasim. You've been living it." He rose to his feet. "This isn't a job offer. A job is something you apply for. This is a restoration. Effective immediately, I am creating a new position at Vance Global, Executive Vice President of Cultural Strategy and International Relations. You will report directly to me. Your first task will be to build a team to ensure that we never, ever walk into a room this blind and arrogant again. You will be our custodian, our compass." Layla stared at him, speechless. The words didn't seem real. Executive Vice President? It was a title from another planet. "The starting salary," he continued, "will be 7 figures. We will also pay off your family's remaining medical debt in full. We will create a trust to fund your sister's education, wherever she chooses to go, for as long as she chooses to study. And we will provide a grant to Columbia to reinstate your PhD program with a full stipend for you to complete whenever and however you see fit. Consider it a research expense." I don't know what to say," she stammered, the world tilting on its axis. "Say yes," came a voice from the doorway. It was one of the Sheikh's senior advisors. He had returned, holding a small, beautifully wrapped gift box. "His Excellency wished for you to have this." Layla opened it. Inside, nestled on a bed of silk, was an antique fountain pen, its barrel inlaid with mother of pearl. "He said a poet should have a proper pen," the advisor explained with a smile. "He also said that if Mr. Vance ever fails to appreciate your wisdom, the Al-Fajr Legacy Council will always have a seat for its chief architect." Tears finally welled in Layla's eyes. They were tears of relief, of grief for her father, who would have been so proud, and of a profound, overwhelming sense of coming home. The scholar, the dreamer, the daughter, the woman she thought she had been forced to bury, was alive and well. She had been there all along, waiting in the silence for the right words to be spoken. 2 months later, Layla stood not in a penthouse suite, but on a windswept expanse of desert sand under the brilliant Emirati sun. A gentle breeze carried the scent of dust and sea salt. Beside her, Marcus Vance and Sheikh Khalid looked at a set of revised blueprints. "The central plaza," Layla said, pointing to the heart of the design. "We curve the colonnades here to echo the shape of the crescent moon, and the main fountain will not be a jet of water shooting into the sky. It will be a chabutra, a quiet pool that reflects it, reminding us that true strength is often found in tranquility." The sheikh nodded, a look of deep contentment on his face. "The wisdom of the Oasis," he said softly, glancing at Layla with a paternal smile. Layla smiled back. She was no longer a waitress serving tea in the gilded cages of the powerful. She was here, under an endless sky, on the ground floor of a dream, helping to build a city with a soul. Her past was not a series of misfortunes that had derailed her life. It was the crucible that had forged her. And her future was no longer about surviving until the next shift, but about ensuring that the silent poetry that connects all of humanity would never ever be lost in translation again.